Hey everybody, it's Mr. Mazzoro, and today, the very last botany lesson. And my very last botany lesson talks about ecosystem sustainability. We're going to talk about why some ecosystems are sustainable and why some aren't. We're going to talk about what makes them sustainable, and then we're going to talk about one way, the primary way that we grow most plants that you come in contact with in your life, monocultures. We're going to talk about why we grow plants in a monoculture, what the problems with monocultures are, because there certainly are a lot of them, and then how we try to compensate for those monocultures and the problems that they bring. What we're doing to plants to try to compensate for the fact that we're growing them in a very unsustainable way. Last, we're going to talk about how monocultures relate to invasive species, what invasive species are, and what they have to do with the way we grow most plants. The idea of sustainability is basically just that. It's the ability for an environment to meet human needs without declining over time. If an environment is sustainable, then in the simplest terms, we can feed, clothe, and build buildings for ourselves to live in. If it's not sustainable, we can't do those things and we die. So environmental sustainability is actually really important because the idea of environmental sustainability has directly to do with the ability of man to live on the planet. So what makes something sustainable? Well, the answer is biological diversity. Biological diversity is the amount of living things within an ecosystem, and that can mean a lot of things. An ecosystem is biologically diverse when all three or any number of these things are true. When there are many different types of the same type of plant, many different types of angiosperms, many different types of bushes, many different types of fox, I don't know. That makes an ecosystem biologically diverse, one of the things. Also, ecosystems are biologically diverse when there's many different organisms there. So it isn't just a field of a bunch of different types of poppies. There's poppies and a bunch of other different types of plants as well, like a forest. Lastly, when there's a lot of different mini ecosystems inside the same environment. Kind of a weird example of this, but here you have a sunny side of the street and a shady side of the street. The shady side still has snow on it, the sunny side doesn't. So you have two different ecosystems really within the same, mini ecosystems really within the same one big ecosystem. Again, not really the best example of that, but as long as all three of these things are present, you have biological diversity, you have sustainable ecosystems. When one or more of these things isn't true, you have a less and less sustainable ecosystem, and all of a sudden it's harder and harder for us to get what we need out of nature to survive. The problem is we grow things in a monoculture. Human beings over the past 100 years especially have been taking over the land and planting only one type of plant in one location. This is as unsustainable as you can get, because it doesn't have any biological diversity at all. There aren't many different types of organisms. In fact, we spray the fields with herbicides and pesticides and fungicides to keep down all the other organisms. There isn't many different types of one type of plant because we only plant one type of plant. And there certainly aren't many different ecosystems in this ecosystem because it's one big flat field that nothing else lives in. Why do we grow plants in this really unsustainable way? Well, very, very simply, monocultures make food less expensive by producing more in less space with less work. And it's very, very easy to demonize farmers for growing crops in monocultures, right? Oh, those evil farmers. But what you have to remember is that this is an economic decision. Someone decided, and thank God that they did, that it's a really good thing if everyone can eat. And a way that everyone can eat is if there's enough food to feed everyone cheaply. In the 1920s and 30s, food was 1/3 of a household income. 1/3 of everyone's paycheck in America went towards buying food. Now, in current times, it's less than 10% of household income goes towards buying food. And if you want proof of that, think of what you spend your money on. Chances are, when you get money, you don't have to say, man, I really wanted that sweater, but I have to put $6 aside of all this money because I need to eat something in the next week. Food's cheap because we grow it in a monoculture, this less expensive, more producing, less work way. But the cost of that is that it's a very unsustainable way of growing. And there are consequences. The lack of biodiversity in a monoculture creates 4 huge problems. Number 1, it breeds sickness and disease in plants. Same plant, planted over and over again. When one gets sick, they all get sick. Number 2, since we're always planting the same hybrids over and over and over again, because we always want our mangoes to taste the same and our apples to taste the same, monocultures cause inbred populations, and there's some inbred corn. It also encourages invasive species, plants that weren't ever supposed to be in an environment, to invade an ecosystem and take over. And I'll explain how at the end. And last but not least, it causes natural pollinators to decline. Bees are the produce aisle of a supermarket is about 90% the consequence of a honeybee pollinating a crop. And honeybees have evolved for millions and millions of years, going around forests, searching out a bunch of different variety of a bunch of different types of crops to pollinate. In the last really 80 years, what we've been doing is we've been forcing honeybees not to have this large variety of plants to pollinate, but really just to pollinate one plant over and over and over and over and over again. As a result, it causes honeybees to get sick and die. This idea of planting this monoculture of potato plants to pollinate or nut trees to pollinate causes honeybees or other pollinators to have an asymmetric diet, and that's not good for them, and their populations decline over time like they have been. And when honeybees go away, we don't have any more food to eat and we die. So how are we fighting against this? How are we stopping plants from going down? Well, the first thing we're doing is we're hybridizing plants. We're taking the best possible versions of plants with the best possible traits. We're slamming them together to get the best possible plant. We're basically forcing what would randomly happen through millions of years of evolution instead to happen over a couple of generations. This is not a bad practice. On its face, it really truly isn't, and don't let anyone ever tell you that hybridizing is dangerous. It's not. It's actually doing what's natural. It's just doing the best version of what's natural. Nature would have eventually produced a tangerine. It's just that it probably would have taken 4 billion years. So what we did was we took a grapefruit and a tangelo, and we slammed them. We took a grapefruit and a tangerine, we slammed it together, and we got a tangelo. So hybrids aren't a bad thing. Hybrids become a bad thing when we get tangelos, this thing that we really, really like, and all of a sudden we plant a monoculture of tangelos. Now we've turned hybrids, this best possible version of a plant, into a monoculture with lack of genetic diversity. So you can take hybrids, which promote genetic diversity, and actually cause them to, and use them in the wrong way and exclude that. We also make genetically modified plants, and there's a big misunderstanding about what a genetically modified plant is. So this is what a genetically modified plant is. Very, very simply, it's a plant that had DNA from another type of organisms inserted into it. For instance, when we hybridize plants, that's plant mixed with plant, plant mates with plant, plant DNA 100% through, you get plants. In the case of these potatoes, these are GMO potatoes because there's a Colorado potato beetle that eats monocultures of potato fields. So what we did was we took bacteria DNA and we exerted less than 1% of bacteria DNA in those plants. Now, bacteria can't mate with potatoes, so you can never have a bacteria-potato hybrid. But because we literally inserted it into the genes of those plants in a lab, what we got was a potato with some traits of this bacteria, specifically this bacteria that produces a pesticide to kill Colorado potato beetles. Potatoes that produce their own insecticide. Here's rice. And here's rice that's golden because it's been genetically modified to produce more B12 vitamin, which makes it more nutritious. We inserted animal genes into this rice, which causes it to produce B12 vitamin. Now, again, this would never happen in nature, and that's why people don't like genetically modified plants. They don't like genetically modified plants because even though on the face of them they're beneficial, this wouldn't happen in nature. Never would a bacteria mate with a plant and make a bacteria-plant hybrid. Never would an animal mate with rice and make a rice-animal hybrid. And once these plants are in the wild and that DNA is in the wild, it can spread, and we don't know what the consequences of that is. More to the point, if we plant a monoculture of genetically modified plants, all of a sudden we're again reducing the biological diversity and reducing sustainability. And that tends to be what happens with genetically modified plants, is due to the cost structure of getting them and growing them, you're forced to plant them in a monoculture in order to make them profitable. Last, we have invasive species. An invasive species is a foreign organism, in this case plants, but it could be anything, that come into an ecosystem where it doesn't have any natural checks, and so it grows unchecked. If you look, this is Lake Victoria, and it looks like a field, but this is a boat. And that's because Lake Victoria is being invaded by water hyacinth, South American water hyacinth. So much so that it's basically growing unchecked, and it's causing Lake Victoria, one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world, to look like a lawn or a field. Monocultures actually encourage invasive species because monocultures break up the natural environment. Again, monocultures never happen in an environment. Nature never puts one tree over and over again in rows. It puts a bunch of different trees and a bunch of different bushes. Now, if that were a farm, it'd be really inefficient because a farmer can't make a profit off of one strawberry plant growing under a bunch of oak trees. Not as easily, at least, as he would be if he just planted strawberries over and over again. So that breakup of the natural environment actually clears way for faster growing invasive species, faster growing because they don't have any natural checks, to come in and take over. So that's it for environmental sustainability. The idea that nature needs to keep producing what we need it to produce in order for us to live, and sometimes we do things to nature, more often than not, we do things to nature that stop it from being able to do that. We stop nature from being biologically diverse, and therefore we stop it from being sustainable. We stop it from being biologically diverse because we plant things in a monoculture, because this makes food cheaper, it allows everyone to eat. However, those monocultures are not sustainable because they're not biologically diverse. And therefore they invite pests and disease, they invite inbred populations, they invite invasive species, and they decline natural pollinators. So we start changing plants around, genetically modifying them or hybridizing them in order to make them better resist this way we're forcing them to grow because we want food to be cheap. We want more people to eat. Monocultures necessarily also break up the natural landscape, and as a result, clear room for invasive organisms to come in and take over in an ecosystem, because those invasive species, without any natural predators, grow much faster than natural organisms and therefore grow unchecked and can take over a lot faster than natural organisms. Ecosystem sustainability is really, really, really important because on its simplest terms, it's how we're going to feed ourselves and our children's children in the future. The key to a sustainable ecosystem is biological diversity. And as long as you grow things in a biologically diverse way, then you'll get a sustainable ecosystem and we'll be able to feed our children and our children's children. If you're going to concentrate on anything as a plant ecologist, one of the most beneficial things that you can concentrate on is trying to merge these ideas of how to grow things sustainably and economically, how to make food cheap and affordable and plentiful while not having to grow them in a way that nature wouldn't intend. If you find out how to do that and how to make it spread throughout the nation and throughout the world, not only will you feed the world, but you'll also save our children's and our environment. And boy, wouldn't that be great. But hopefully you're smarter than me because I haven't figured out a great feel-safe way of doing it yet. So that's it for today. And that's actually it for botany. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. And that's all. See you guys.